I'm going to give you today a brief introduction into Blender, and hopefully it inspires you to get started in the software and maybe shows you a couple of ways of using it. If you haven't heard of Blender yet, you've maybe seen a couple of results from Blender or similar software. For example, in animation, in short films like the one shown here, where Blender was used to make something that looks very much like a 2D animation but with 3D software. Also in visual effects. So in the great movie RRR, the team used Blender to do all the visual effects in that movie. So you see some behind the scenes where they use Blender to create all the 3D models. You can also use it for scientific visualization. So this is a talk by a guy who's made a tool within Blender to be able to visualize molecules and import them from like general databases about enzymes, so you can show and visualize scientific data in a very appealing and attractive way. And he shows that you can now do it in a very simple way, even load in simulations that took days and weeks to simulate, and then show them in a very nice way. I myself also use Blender for explainers for my own research. I use it for paper figures, also for creative uses, and for videos where I try to explain what my research does in a nice and appealing way. So as you see, Blender can be used in a lot of different ways, and not only in making nice visuals, but also for prototyping your own research. You often want to do something very quickly and just try something out, and then Blender is a very nice tool because it has all the algorithms, a lot of the algorithms implemented, and if you know how to use it, you can quickly test something out. So highly versatile for animation, VFX, scientific visualization, and prototyping. Now, often you might think that the first thing to do when you want to create something, create a visual, is to open Blender. What I'd argue is that's probably not the way you want to go. Because it's such a versatile piece of software, there are so many things you can do, it can often be quite overwhelming. So I would argue that it's better often to first have some sketch of what you'd want to do, and then iterate on that before you jump into software like Blender. The reason for this is that if you have this idea already in your mind, and then you have a goal and a motivation to work towards something. And I'll show you a couple of ways that you can then translate those things like a sketch into steps in Blender. But overall, I would often say, try something where you can iterate quickly, for example, sketch on pen and paper, see if you can work out your ideas and get a good visual communication, and then move into Blender. Now, once you've done that, the typical process of using software like Blender is that you would start by modeling. And a lot of the tools that you're working on in this course are in this domain where you try to model a 3D world, for example, with meshes, but it can also be the point clouds or volumes. So you try to represent your scene in a virtual representation and create that yourself. Then you would work on lighting and shading, making sure that you can simulate light on these objects in a nice way, in the way that you want it to be, and then render the images. And I'll go through each of these steps. I'll also show a couple of more advanced techniques that you can use for your prototyping, which is procedural modeling with geometry nodes in Blender, and also then animating them and using some ways to simulate. Now, if you're interested in more information after this lecture, I can highly recommend the following links, which is blender.org has a download page where they not only allow you to download the software itself, but also a lot of the demo files. So these are Blender files where they've created really cool images, for example, for their short films, and you can use all of it. You can see and edit it and try and reverse engineer how images were made. Also, really highly recommended is the Blender Guru tutorials. He has a donut tutorial that I think almost 90% of people learned how to use Blender through this donut tutorial. So it's a really nice overview of all the things you would need to model general things shown through a specific donut. So you would learn how to do the modeling, how to do texturing, how to use geometry nodes to add things on top of the donut and the shading. And finally, on research.sigraph.org, SIGGRAPH is the sort of organization of computer graphics research. On the research page, there is a list of guides for paper writing, and there are some guides for specific use of Blender to create figures for papers. So if you're interested in that, then I'd recommend that as well. So let's get started with modeling first. And what I'd like you to do is, if you have your laptop with you, to grab it and try and find a way that you can follow along with me. If not, that's okay. I think I can show you some of the basic principles without you necessarily following along, but I think it's nice to join in. You can join me and go to blender.org. You would go to the download page, and then you would click the button that corresponds to your own operating system. It'll detect for you which operating system you have, so you don't have to wonder too much. You can just click the button and download. It'll start downloading, and you can download it and install it. I think if you're on Windows, Linux, or Mac, you don't need to run the installer yourself. Maybe on Windows you would have to run an installer. So while that runs, I'll run over the basic things of Blender. You don't have to do too much yourself while it's installing, while you can start it running. All right. So once that's installed, you can open Blender. And let me start from the very start. Just like you would open Blender, you would open Blender. And you would see a splash screen that I just clicked away. You can click anywhere and then you would see this. And I want to just quickly go over some of the basic parts in Blender. So we have this large screen in Blender here, and it's made up of a couple of panes within it, P-A-N-E. The largest one you see here is the viewfinder, and this is the one where you will be working mostly. Aside from the viewfinder, or to the left of the viewfinder, we have the tools toolbar. This is always within this viewfinder pane. So we'll be grabbing some of these tools later on to be able to edit objects, move them around, scale them, and really work with your objects. Then we have the properties pane, and this is the place where all the properties of objects are located and where you can adjust them. For example, here you see the location of this object. I can click and drag around and thereby adjust parts of my object. Next is the outliner. This is the place where all the objects within your scene are listed. So we see that there is a cube and there's a camera already. That's this camera over here. We have a light. That's basically it. Inside this outliner, we can create groups called collections, and that helps us to organize our scenes so we're not overwhelmed with huge scenes with millions of objects. Next is the timeline. We'll take a look at this later on when we talk about animating objects. What you see here is the frames, the count of frames over time. And you might be familiar that in a video, you have a number of frames after each other, often 30 if you're in the US, 24 if you're in Europe. You can add keyframes here. And keyframes are places where you say, this is where my object should be at this time. And then often the software will compute in between what happens between those keyframes. All right. Then those are the main panes that you see at the start. Then there are a couple of specific controls like files, opening files, also import and export. These are important if you start to work with models that you, for example, download from the internet. You would often download something like an OBJ file or a ply file, and this allows you to import those into your scene. Edit, this is where preferences are, often quite important. And then render. This is the step that we'll take at the end, where you render an image. These are the main things you need to know. A tip here is that this interface, it's very customizable. So as you see, I can already move around panes. I can do that by clicking on the edge between panes and then shifting it around with my mouse. I can add new panes, for example, by right-clicking the boundary between it. So I'm here with my mouse, right-clicking between it, then saying I want a vertical split, and then I can split panes to get a new screen. I can then change which pane this is by always going at the top left corner of a pane and then selecting some different view that I want. Now, often what you see people do is sometimes they want two viewfinders, where in one place they look from one position and then in the other they can do something else, and allows you to really customize how you work with your software. If I want to remove a pane, I can right-click and then join. It allows me to go back to this one pane. Blender also has a couple of configurations pre-made for you, which are outlined on the top here as tabs. So these are made for specific parts of the process in making some 3D animation or a 3D image. And these are just pre-made configurations of panes. So there's nothing special to them. You can make these yourself, but it can be helpful to see all the tools that are available for you. So we've shown the viewfinder, we have the different panes. Now let's see how we can actually move around and navigate this viewfinder. The main thing is you're going to use your mouse. If you have a mouse like the one I have, so I have a mouse like this, and I have the left button, right button, and the middle button. And the middle button is the one that's going to be used a lot. Okay. If you don't have a mouse but you have your laptop, then you can often use just two fingers for the middle button thing that I'm doing, and follow along. So if you want to move around, you click the middle button. You can also see this on the bottom here. So if you ever wonder what I'm doing with my either keyboard or mouse, you can see that over there. And if you click the middle button and move around your mouse, you can move around your object. So you rotate the camera around it. For your laptop, it would be moving around with two fingers. So I'll show that just here. So you would use two fingers to move around. You can also zoom in, like with the normal pinch to zoom type stuff. If you press Shift and move around, then you pan around the camera. Scrolling is zooming in and out. You can also press on Mac, I think, Command and then press middle button to zoom in and out. And those are, I think, the main things you need to navigate around objects. Now, the reason why you would navigate around this is often that you want to see something from a certain perspective, to be able to edit it, or to see whether something's correct. So you probably use this quite a bit. There are also a couple of useful toggles at the top right that allow you to snap to certain views. So here they're showing the axis, the coordinate axis that you'd have in your 3D world, so X, Y, and Z. And if you click on them, you look right along this axis that you click on. And that's useful if you want to do some precise work, or if you want to, for example, move just in one specific axis. So that's a way to get around the viewfinder. Then let's look at how we can actually edit objects. And now one important thing to note, or to know when you're editing objects, is that there are specific modes in Blender that you can work in. The main ones that you need to know are object mode and edit mode. And if we go to the top left of your screen over here, you see which ones you can select. So you see object mode, edit mode, and then a couple of other modes that allow you to, for example, sculpt, paint. This is for texture painting. But object mode and edit mode are the most important ones. The main distinction between these two is that object mode allows you to edit the object as a whole. So say that I make a transformation that I just did before. This is sort of separating this transformation from the object and storing this transformation separately. If you're familiar with transformations in linear algebra, then it's this 4x4 matrix that makes the transformation. And it doesn't apply to the object itself. Now this is helpful because often you want to use the same object in multiple locations. And if you separate the transformation from the object itself, then you can just reuse that object everywhere. So it saves on memory, on computations. So that's one of the reasons why you would separate it out. The edit mode, so if we click on the top left, select edit mode, allows us to actually change very specific parts of our object. So you see that there are now points at the corners. These are the vertices of this mesh. And we can select them and change these. I'll show you in a minute how I do this, what I'm doing here with moving around. So I can actually move around parts of the object. And in edit mode, things like this change. Often you'll find yourself by accident in one of these modes. So if you're stuck in Blender and you don't know why it's happening, be sure to check these modes. A quick way to move around the modes, so to toggle between them, is to press the Tab key. And that allows us to toggle between edit and object mode. Right. Okay, so I have all this. Now, then to the part where we can actually change objects and start creating our own things. I've already shown you the toolbar here on the left. And what I could do is start clicking on these tools and use these to adjust my objects. So I can use the move tool. I click on it, I click with my left mouse also on these draggable parts, and that allows me to shift around and move this object. What you'll often see people do is they use shortcuts on the keyboard to do these actions because it takes a long time to move back and forth between these tools. It's difficult to remember these at the first time, so I'll show you a trick, which is to hover over the tools a little bit longer than usual, and then you'll see right underneath the move selected items, you see that it says shortcut, shift spacebar, and then G. Shift spacebar allows us to show all these tools quite close to the mouse. And G, when I press it, so I first need to select an object that I want to move around. So I first click on the object, I press G, and then you see that I can start moving around the object itself. And that's a very quick way that if you have these in your system, then you can really quickly move around, scale, rotate. I just showed you how to scale and rotate, but I'll show that in a minute. What you'll notice is when you start moving things around is that the place where it moves around is always orthogonal to the direction you're viewing. So if I'm moving around from this direction, it moves there. If I move it around from this direction, it moves here. So it sort of depends on where you're looking. And this can be quite finicky. So what you might want to do is move it just along one axis. That makes it much more precise. There's a shortcut for that as well. You can just press first G to move things around, or well, actually, I'll show you first this. So what I mean with moving along an axis is what I'm doing here is clicking on this axis and moving it along. One way to do this with shortcuts is to first press the button for moving around. The G is for a nice way to think about it as grab. You grab it, and then you press the name of the axis to constrain it to it. So we press X, for example, and it sticks only to this X-axis. Y to the Y-axis, Z to the Z-axis. If you press it twice, it's going to be the axis of the object itself. So let's say I rotate this around the X-axis, and then I'll grab it and press Z twice. When I press twice, it's going to happen relative to the coordinate system of the object. So now I can move it along the object's coordinate system around. Final thing is that you can also move in every direction but the axis. And then you have to press Shift. So G, so for grabbing, G for grabbing. Then I press Shift and Z, for example. And then it constrains it to the plane that is orthogonal to your Z-axis. So this is quite a bit, but if you start putting it in your system, then you can really do things really quickly. And if you don't want to remember, then you can just always go to the tools. Next, you want to sometimes scale, meaning make it larger or smaller, the object. And that we do by pressing S. So we hover over again to see the shortcut. Shortcut is S, so I press S, and then I can move my mouse around to scale and downscale objects. Here again, I can use these axes to constrain my transformation. So press X, it only scales it along the x-axis. Y, only the y-axis. Shift Z, only along this axis. Finally, rotation. So here I press R. So rotate, I see the shortcut is R, and then I can rotate it. Here as well, these X's are very helpful to be able to rotate. And you'll see here that it can be helpful to rotate around the axis of the object itself. Now, I mentioned before that all the properties are stored in the properties panel. So all the changes I made are non-destructive. Everything I can still edit and change back to what they were, for example, in the properties panel. So I can click and type, and it allows me to edit these very precisely. So there are often many ways to do the exact same thing in Blender, and it's just using it a couple of times, for example, with the tutorial that I shared before, where you really have some muscle memory that you build up. Right, so then we are able to change this object. We can move it, scale it, rotate it. Now, if we go into edit mode, there we can do all the exact same things, but then for parts of the object, sort of parts in the object. So the vertices we can grab with G, we can then move them around. You'll note that if I want to scale a vertex, it's not going to do anything, because scaling a point, that doesn't make sense, it doesn't do anything. So what would make sense, for example, is to scale a line, because it has some area that you can actually scale. One thing I can do is I can select two vertices, and I can do that by clicking and then pressing Shift and clicking. And then I can scale, for example, these two vertices. Say I want to scale this whole face of this box, of this cube. I could go around, press Shift, and select every one of them. But that's quite slow. So can't I just select edges or faces? You can by going to the top left of the screen and then pressing either this, so select mode edge, or select mode faces. And as you might imagine, there is a shortcut for this as well by pressing 1, 2, or 3. So you can press 2, 1, 2, or 3. And it might be that this is occluded by some zoom UI. So let me see if I can get this a little bit lower. So I'm clicking here, 1, 2, 3. So if I'm in the face selection mode, I can select a face and then scale and downscale this. I press 2 to make edges selected, and I can then scale with S, translate with G, grab, and rotate with R, also constrained to specific axes. So back to this overview. We showed already a little bit how you can model objects. So modeling that is by working on these meshes, moving them, scaling them. And then the next thing is actually making objects from these very base shapes, like the cubes. And the way to think about this, I think, is sort of analogous to how people use sketching. If you've ever done any sketching course in cartoons, you'll notice that often people start with something with a sphere. That's the most basic shape that people often start with. So they use a sphere, and then they use construction lines where they then add parts of the face, the eyes, the nose. So when you're working in 3D, I'd argue that it helps to think in the same way about 3D objects. And often to think about what shapes are the objects around me really made of? What basic shapes are they made of? So one of the reasons for this, I think, is that it really helps to start simple, because if you start in a very complex way, then any change you have to make later on means you have to make a lot of different changes. You already saw before when I started selecting the face, I would have to select all the vertices. The fewer vertices you have to select, the easier it becomes later on to change your objects. So it really helps to construct your shapes from very simple base shapes, and then add things later on to make them more complex. So for an example, this hammer, what type of base shapes is this hammer made of? I'll let you think for a couple of seconds. So if I look at this hammer, I could break it down. This is not the right answer, but I would break it down into a cylinder for the handle of the hammer, and then a cuboid or a box for the head of the hammer. Now you'll notice there are some parts like this, this notch in the hammer that's not exactly a cuboid, but we could probably find a way to sort of squeeze in the cuboid to make it fit this way. One more shape, this little owl. What type of base shape would you think started here? So I can imagine you probably thought something like a sphere or something that looks like a sphere. And that's correct. So this is from, actually this image I took from a tutorial on showing how to sculpt really complex shapes. And what people often do when they start sculpting is they first use this base shape, and then they move it around a little bit, and then, for example, subtract parts from it. So these eyes of the owl, you could even subtract a sphere from it. And I think if you start working in 3D software this way, you sort of start to build up a skill of building up shapes from very basic components. And that makes it much easier to edit them later on, and also to really have nice shapes. So let's put this into practice and go back to Blender and back to our cube. And I think it'd be nice to try and make the hammer that we just saw. To make it easier to replicate this hammer, I'll add a reference image. You don't really need to follow with this step along, but I'll just do it in Blender just to show that it's possible. What I'm doing is I did a lot of steps that I didn't actually show you what I was doing. So let me go back. What I did first was I deleted the object. One way to do that is to click with your right mouse button and then say delete. And you see there as well, there is a shortcut listed next to it, which is X. So I press X, I click on delete, and then it's removed. Now to add a new object, I can press Shift A, and that gives me a menu to start selecting things that I want to add. You'll immediately see in the mesh category that there are these basic shapes that I talked about before. So the cube, UV sphere, icosphere, cylinder. And these are your basic building blocks that you can start constructing with. If you forgot about the shortcut, it's right at the top here. You can see add and also add these components. So I'll first add an image, a reference image, which is this hammer. And this is an image that is actually in the image plane over here. What I'll do is I'll add it again from this view and then shift it with G to the side. So we have this sort of view of the hammer that we want to create. Now, one way is to think about this as this cylinder and the cube, but then we'd have to merge two shapes. So I'll do it in a little bit of a different way than what I proposed before. What I'm going to do, and I'm pressing D and then clicking here to annotate. You don't have to do this with me, but what I want to do is you can sort of think of this hammer as this T-shaped block, where on this side we have this sort of thing to get out nails. And one way to think of this is as a cube, where the sides of the cube have been sort of pulled out. And a word for that is extruded. So you extrude these sides of the face. And that's often something that you'll do when you're 3D modeling, is you grab these basic shapes and then you extrude parts of it to really sort of shape your 3D shapes. So let's start with this cube. And I'll press Shift A, then click on the mesh and then add the cube. You'll see it gets added there. If you're not in this view, by the way, remember there's this toggle at the top where you can press the X one to really see this specific view. Then I'll scale it to match what I want. Pressing S, shifting around the mouse and then clicking to confirm. I grab it to move up. I press Z to constrain it, and then it's right there. Now I want to make changes to this specific object, so within the object that are lasting. So I have to shift to edit mode. I can either click here and go to edit mode, or wait, I have to first select the object, otherwise it doesn't know where the edit mode should be adjusted. So I click the object, I select it, and then I'm in edit mode. I can zoom in a little bit. Now I mentioned that we want to extrude these faces. So again, we'll move to select mode where we select faces. We can press 3 for that, or click there. And then we're just going to simply click the face, press E to extrude, and then drag the mouse along to extrude it. So once you have a distance that you want, you can click again, and then it's there. Then it's extruded and settled. If you want to know how much you extrude, you can see at the top corner there how much it is. So it's at 2.1. So you can type 1 meter, or you can press Control, I think, to have it shift to specific intervals. But I think this is fine. We're not going for full accuracy here. It doesn't have to be produced. It's just as a prop in a video. So we extrude this. Also, here's the extrude button. We go down to the bottom. I want to extrude this as well. And there we have part of our T shape. So we're almost done. The last thing that I want to do is I want to get this, these two, I don't know what the name for it is in English, but these two parts that sort of stick out and are curved down. What I want to do here is, one thing I could do is I can extrude this and then grab the face and sort of pull it down, and then we're almost there. But that doesn't give me the split that I wanted. So what I'll do first is I can select the face and split the face by right-clicking and then subdivide. Now this gives me 4 faces to work with. And I can just extrude each of these 2 faces first. Let's make sure that it's, so I type in 1 meter. This is a huge hammer. I select the other face, I extrude it. There we have 2 parts. I can scale these down, for example, to a bit like this. And there we have almost these 2 parts. If I select both of them and press extrude, it extrudes both of them. So that's a way that we can work a little bit. We can now extend this and extrude it. I grab it and shift these down a little bit, and that gives me this curved shape. One thing that's not really nice about this hammer is that it's very edgy. It's very like sharp edges. It's not really curved and doesn't really have these nice roundings that a real hammer would have. And that's a bit similar, or one technique that has been developed in computer graphics, which is similar to curves that you might draw in something like Illustrator, is subdivision surfaces. The general idea here is that if you have a couple of points that are connected, they sort of describe a smooth curve between them. And one way to get to this curve is to keep adding points on this line that get closer and closer to this curve. And that's a subdivision surface algorithm, one of the very important key algorithms that made computer graphics possible in the early days, and is still used a lot to really make these smooth lines. So if we look at this, for example, what would happen if we add this subdivision? Let me just remove these annotations. So if we were to add the subdivision, we have these lines, and it's going to make this sort of this curve down. Now the way that you apply these types of things to objects in Blender is we go to object mode. We make sure that we're in object mode. We go to modifiers in the properties panel. So that's here on the side, you have these little tabs, and there's the this modifiers button. And we add it as a modifier. Now a modifier is steps that are taken on your object without changing the object itself. So it's non-destructive. You can remove them, reorder them later on. And then you apply subdivision surface. So we click on add modifier. Under generate, click subdivision surface. And you'll see that it starts to make these shapes smoother and smoother. As I said before, subdivision surface is iterative. So you can do a couple of levels of this subdivision here in the viewport. So what we see here is 1. And if we increase it, it becomes smoother and smoother. Also, just to make sure that you, if you're working on a laptop or a computer that doesn't have a lot of memory or compute, you want to keep this level low for your viewport. You could increase it when you render, because then often you're not working with it, then you're just waiting for it to render, so then you could have it higher. But there's one thing that is not really nice about this. So it's nice that it's smoother, but this hammer has these sharp corners. And one thing that you could do, and I think a lot of people do, there's probably a better way to do this, but what a lot of people do is they say, well, okay, the subdivision surface tries to make a curve that goes between these points, and if I just add a point here, then the curve has to sort of stick closer here. One way to do this is we click the object, we go to edit mode, and then we want to add some points here. Now you can do that by adding a ring around this object. And you do that by pressing Control R. And you see here, there's this yellow line. So when you press Control R, it gives you the option to select first where you want to make this split. So here I'm hovering over this part, it will make it here. If I'm hovering over here, it'll do it here. So you have to sort of figure out where it's automatically detects where you want to do it. So we want to add it here. We click, then we can shift around to place it somewhere. And then we can click again when we find the location correct. So something quite close to here. You can do that again to make sure at the bottom it's nice and sharp. And then we want the hammer's head to also be nice and sharp. So we press Control R, we select it here, we click, and we shift it forward. This is one of those tools that if you do it a couple times, figure it out. It's also explained in this Blender tutorial. One more thing is if you press Control R, and then scroll, and you can increase the amount of rings you add. So what I'm gonna do is maybe add this little notch over here. So I'm press Control R, I scroll, and that gives me the outline of this notch. And maybe I'll add one more because right over there. And now I can scale this region to be a little bit smaller, so we have this notch. I can do that by selecting each of these faces around. So I move around, press Shift, and I click. And another quick way to do this is to automatically select a loop, because this forms a loop around. What I do for that is press Alt or Option, and then click. And I do have to press the correct one. This is one of those finicky things in Blender that sometimes it tries to find the automatic loop. Oh, by the way, am I still, is the screen still moving for you or not? Yes, it's just the camera. So I select the loop, then I press S to scale it down. Sorry. S to scale it down, and that gives me this sort of notch that we had in the hammer. And there you have it, almost a perfect hammer. So we started from very basic shapes, and what's really nice about the subdivision surface algorithm is that even though you have all these very specific, like all these faces and vertices that are in there, you also have this cage that you can work with that makes it much easier to control and, for example, to animate later on or to store somewhere. So that's a whirlwind into modeling with Blender. I have 15 minutes left. I'll show you a couple more things. And I think it's most important to see how you can first render it, show you how to do some materials, and then if we have time, animate. But that's probably something that I'll just show you that it's possible, and then you can figure out those things on your own. Let's go back. So lighting and shading. So when we simulate how an object is photographed, that's what we basically do in computer graphics. We simulate how light moves from some light source, hits an object, and then this light scatters around your scene and hits your camera, and then we record it as a pixel. The way that the light interacts with the object is described by a BRDF. That is an acronym for bidirectional reflectance distribution function. It says for an incoming light direction and an outgoing light direction, so that's the bidirectional, how much light is reflected into that direction. And it's a distribution because not all light is reflected into one location, it's sometimes located in other angles. So it's distributed over these outgoing light angles. And the software doesn't know from the start how the light interacts with it, so we need to tell it. We need to say, for example, the light interacts with it like a very diffuse surface, for example, something like wood or plastic, or it acts like something like metal, like a very mirror-like thing. There, all the light is reflected into one direction. Add materials to Blender is by clicking on the object. We go to the properties panel again, and we can select the material. Then it doesn't have a material yet, so we click on New, and there, this it gives us already a BRDF function. Here, the one that is selected is the principled BSDF, and this is a BSDF that was described by Disney in this paper. So if you're interested in this type of thing, then look up this one, Physically Based Shading at Disney. They describe a method to describe how materials interact with light in a way that is particularly helpful for artists to control. So this is, they try to be as physical as possible, but also allow artists to change things. And the things you often want to change are things like the color of your object, the roughness, so I talked about wood, plastic, or metal, and then metallicness. Now, if you try and change these, so for example the base color, and I want it to be this sort of orangey color, then you can see that it doesn't change in your viewfinder. So how do we actually see the object change in the materials? Well, for that we have to change the view mode, and that's at the top right corner over here. You see these little orbs? You can do a wireframe or the viewfinder mode. Also here, the material preview, and this is the render preview. The render preview actually shows you what the render is going to look like, and that's one that I like to use. And this depends a lot on what renderer you use. Very quickly, what I'm going here is into the properties panel, into render. You can select two main rendering approaches, which is rasterization and path tracing. The main thing you need to know is rasterization is very fast, but very approximate. So things like this shadow over here are not very accurate. And path tracing is a lot slower, but it is a lot more close to real life. It's not exact often, but it's very close. Blender has Eevee as the rasterizer and Cycles as the path tracer. Now, because path tracing is slow, I don't recommend necessarily doing it on a laptop, but here we have a very simple scene. We have only this hammer and the light source, and we can only see this result if we are in the render preview. So here, over here, only then do we see the path traced result. You'll note that this hammer has all these little facets. If I want to shade it smooth, I can right click and then click shade smooth, and it'll be smooth. That's nice. Now we can start working on our material. So if we go back to this wood, it's sort of shiny because it has this lacquer on it. If we really want it to be physically correct, we'd have a layered BRDF, but right now we'll just say that it's not very metallic, because metallic would have this sort of golden look here, but we can maybe tweak the roughness a little bit to be more and more. You see here this light that it sort of changes to be less rough, so that means that the more rough it is, the more diffuse it becomes. The less rough it is, the more you see these specular highlights that really make it look like sort of this lacquer on top of the wood. Now, this is something that often you just have to play with a little bit. You can think about it from a physical perspective, like is this a plastic-like material or metallic? And then I'd suggest you'd read up a little bit on BRDFs to understand this. So I have 10 more minutes, so I can show you a bit how to animate. So this, or to render first and then how to animate. So this is really the basics of how you adjust these materials, but that's very important to give you the effects you want. Now, if we want an image from this, we need to grab our virtual camera. Let's remove this annotation. Grab our virtual camera, and it's gonna compute all the light, all the rays that come from this camera, hit the object and hit the light. And we can do that by clicking render at the top here. So here, there's a render, and then a render image. And it'll open up a new window where it starts to render the image from your camera view. And then you've created your very first image in Blender. So if you're satisfied with this, you can go to the top here, click image, and then save, and then your image is fully done and saved. Now, this angle of the camera, I didn't really like it because I wanted to show it from what I had before. So how can we adjust the camera? What you can do is you can click this button to toggle to the camera view. That shows you what the camera is seeing. And now the camera is also selected. That means we can grab it and move it around. So I press G to grab it, and maybe move it only along the Z-axis. You can grab it and move it a bit back. That is the Z-axis of the camera. So I press Z twice and then move it back. And there I have maybe more of the view that I wanted. If I want to have a different type of size of the image, I need to adjust what the output dimensions are. So I can do that by going to properties again, and then go to output. There, set the resolution to something else, for example, 1080 by 1080. We see that it becomes a square image. I can zoom in again. And if I'm satisfied with this, I can render the image and again output it. So this is all the ways that you can create a shape. So you create it from very basic shapes. You can use subdivision surface to make it very smooth, and then add materials at the end. I'll show you two more things that you can do, and here it's just the takeaway is that it's possible. You don't need to remember every detail of it. It's just to show that it's possible and how you can do it. So you can sit back, relax a little bit, and just look at what I'm doing without needing to take everything in. So the first thing that I want to show you is that you can animate things. So I showed you this, well, the animation video before, or the one around this chair that was moving. The way I said you can do this is with keyframes. So if I select this object, what I could do is already here rotate this object. Now what if I want to animate this? I do this by adding keyframes in the timeline. So I move the timeline to the frame that I want the object to be in a certain position. And then I go to the things that I wanted to be keyframed. So here it's the location and the rotation. And I want to animate sort of movement where the hammer seems like it's hammering, hitting a nail. I can do two things. I can click here to add keyframes. So here on the right you have these little dots, and if I click on them they become keyframes. Or I can press I while I'm hovering over the values. So here I'm pressing I, and then there, that's insert keyframe. So I for insert, and then this is keyframed. Now I move to maybe like 15 frames, and I adjust this thing. So I want to rotate it around the Z-axis. So I press R and then X, and then maybe move it around a little bit. So here that it's like hitting the nail, maybe more like this. Now I've moved it around, but I haven't recorded the keyframe yet. So if I shift anything around, it's gonna be gone. And you see that here already, that the green ones are things that haven't changed since the last keyframe, but this orange here is something that I've changed. So I press I again to insert a keyframe for all of these, and also for the rotation. And then I've inserted the keyframe. And then you see when I shift around this timeline, it becomes an animation. I can copy the first keyframe to make sure that it goes back up. I did it by pressing Shift D for duplicate, put it at the end, and then it becomes a hammer that hits a nail. I want to shorten the video, and now it becomes a hammer. There we go. And this is possible to do with almost any parameter in Blender. So I just showed it for this rotation translation, but there are so many things that you can keyframe. Even things like this color, I can add a keyframe here, so I can change those. So anything you can imagine, often you can just think, can I keyframe it? Then you can animate it, and you can change it. Then the very last thing is geometry nodes, which I think is really exciting. And if you're into prototyping things for geometry processing, for example, I think it has a lot of potential. I think it doesn't have all the features yet to really make it workable, but it's a really nice start. So geometry nodes allows you to basically program visually in Blender. And what I mean with that is, so say I have this point and I add geometry nodes to it. So I went to the tab for geometry nodes, and it shows me the geometry nodes editor in this pane. I need to add a new geometry nodes sort of script, I would say. And this gives you the input of the geometry. So you could see that as the input to your program, and the output, which is the output of your program. And then I can start adding blocks of functionality in between that works on this geometry. So what I showed before was I was scaling and rotating. I can also do this in the geometry node. So I can add something by pressing Shift A. And then, for example, add, let's see, maybe I want to add some math and vector math. So I think, oh no, this is gonna do to the positions. Wait, what I'll do is this. I'll add a cube to the scene, and instead add the geometry nodes on this, because I think that's a nice thing to show. So I'll add the geometry nodes on this cube. So now the input is a cube. And then what I want to do is add these hammers as instances on the vertices. So then I copy the location of this other hammer onto the locations of the vertices of the cube. And I can do that by adding instance on points. And so now the points are the input geometry, so those are the vertices of your cube. And the output, it's not outputting anything yet because I haven't instant anything on there. I can just grab it and drag in this hammer, get the geometry there, and use that as an instance. And now you see that I've added these hammers as instances on the cube, which I can scale down with the properties. And again, these you can animate as well. So now you have 4 hammers. What's really nice about this type of working is that you can build up from basic blocks, get very complex results, and then really only edit small things to affect a lot of it. So this is a very powerful tool that if you use it in the right way, like this example here, uses geometry nodes within an animation to be able to do this type of simulation effect. So it's really very powerful, and once you get used to it and know the tools, you can use it almost like the same way you do programming. Okay, I hope it's inspired you to try it out and maybe given you some grips to start with. Again, if you're interested in more, check out the Blender website, the Blender Guru tutorial, and some more info on research.siggraph.org. And with that, thank you for your attention, and any questions are welcome.